This video sets out to look at the Russian Revolution and show how George Orwell was involved with trying to discuss that revolution in his novel Animal Farm. We say that Animal Farm is an allegory for the Russian Revolution. By that we mean that he uses the animals and the farm setting as an extended metaphor to discuss major political and historical events that he was concerned with. Animal Farm being an allegory, the farm itself represents a country. It represents Russia. And just like Russia has other countries around it, there are other farms surrounding Manor Farm, which is where the story is set. Just as Russia had a revolution and changed its name, so does Manor Farm have a revolution. It goes from being controlled by Mr. Jones, who stands in for the Tsar of Russia, who was the Emperor of Russia, Nicholas II. So the character Mr. Jones, who's the farmer, is like Nicholas II. And the people in Nicholas's country overthrew him, and just as people overthrew the human master in Animal Farm, the animals who are at the bottom of the heap in Manor Farm, they do all the work for Farmer Jones, but receive none of the benefits of their labour. They are virtually slaves on the farm. They overthrow Mr. Jones with the goal of running the farm for themselves, just as the workers in Russia overthrew their leader. Interesting choice of Orwell's to pick a farm. I think it's deliberate. Russia at the time of the revolution was an extremely backward country. It had over 100 million people still lived as peasants, eking a living from the landscape, very, very poor. There were some cities, but they were very small compared to the big cities of England and the United States. There were, only around 1 million people or 1.5 million people living in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the two main cities, very concentrated working class in factories, but still we're only talking about, well under 1 million workers in both cities. I think more like 500,000 in both cities. So very small working classes, very agricultural economy, really low rates of literacy. And I think that's something that Animal Farm, the novel, also emphasises, that a lack of education and a lack of access to, the ability to read and so forth can hold people back from maintaining control over their lives. One of the other features of Russia was that serfdom, which was a feature of feudalism, which had died out in the Renaissance in Europe, was still operating in Russia right up until 1861 when it was abolished. So it was a very, very backward country. Nicholas II was just like Mr. Jones, was quite a decadent, out-of-touch leader of Russia. He was widely seen as being weak and incompetent. He was also involved in some fairly brutal and unsavoury actions, earning him the nickname of Nicholas the Bloody. So you could describe him as autocratic, much as Mr. Jones was. Some of the other characters in the novel directly relate to real human individuals. Old Major, the original pig who comes up with the theory of animalism and the idea that they should seize control of the farm, he's a blend of the theorist of communism who died well before the revolution, Karl Marx, and also the leader of the revolution, who was a theorist in his own right, a fellow called Vladimir Lenin. He was the architect of the revolution, but died only a few years afterwards, leaving a power vacuum. And Old Major kind of represents those two figures. The other key figures in the novel, Snowball and Napoleon, are also two pigs. They are directly based on a fellow called Trotsky, Leon Trotsky, who is Snowball. He was a revolutionary leader under Lenin, and he led the Red Army. He was exiled by Stalin, who gradually was also a revolutionary leader. He was the character Napoleon is modelled on him. Those two fought for power after Lenin's death. Stalin got the upper hand, exiled Trotsky, and later had him murdered. So Stalin then goes on to develop a real cult of personality. He gradually seizes all power and brings in a kind of totalitarian leadership. or rule. Totalitarian is where the leader has total control over that society, and you cannot say or do anything that is against the leadership, and even your own thoughts can become a crime. If anyone knows what you're thinking, you can be in a lot of trouble. So that character, Napoleon, who is Stalin, Orwell portrays him as having lost sight of the goals of the revolution, and his motivations being increasingly about cementing his power within the society and also increasing the industrial and military might of his little domain. He's also shown to be increasingly capable of making pragmatic alliances with those who should be the enemy of all animals, the humans. So he goes into alliances with the various human farmers around them. And this relates very strongly to Stalin, who around the time of the Second World War got himself into alliances with both the leaders of America and England, and also for a time with Hitler, the Nazi leader, who as a communist he should have been a sworn enemy of. They were for a time in a non-aggression pact. The character Napoleon, who is Stalin, rules by terror, and by sheer terror, by killing people and terrifying them, and also by gaining control of information and making it difficult for people to see and understand the wrong that's being done to them. So he does that by rewriting history and by doctoring records and all those sorts of things. So increasingly, that character Napoleon, who is Stalin, becomes more and more like the human beings that have been overthrown, just as Orwell was of the belief that Stalin became more and more like those autocratic rulers that he had once wanted to overthrow. And that's symbolised by the idea of the pigs gradually taking on the clothing and behaviours of human beings, and finally by walking like them. All right, so now I'm just going to go through a lot of that and unpack it along the way and talk a little bit more about the revolution. George Orwell was concerned with the idea of communism, which was a political philosophy developed by Karl Marx. Karl Marx lived from 1818 to 1883, and he was a German man, and he worked with a guy called Friedrich Engels, also German. They created, I guess, the theory of communism, and it was first outlined in a pamphlet published in 1848 called the Communist Manifesto. They believed that all of human history was about one social class, a higher, more powerful class controlling another, and that human society had progressed where one class had been able to push aside the class that had been oppressing them to create something new. And they saw that as having happened when the capitalists, the new capitalists, were able to push out of the old repressive feudal system to, bring about a freer society where you began to have the development of industry and so forth in the cities. So they thought that human history would eventually transform again, where a new class, being the workers that had been created by the Industrial Revolution and who now worked in very large numbers in factories in the growing European cities. Marx and Engels believed that the next big transformation in society would be when those working people recognised that they had a collective interest and they themselves overthrew their masters and took hold of the newly created wealth that the Industrial Revolution had brought about and started to manage that for the general good rather than for the profit making of a few. So that was the idea of Marx and Engels coming from the 1840s onwards. It was an idea that appealed to a lot of people. It was called communism and sometimes socialism. And Karl Marx called for the workers of the world to unite, and many people around the world tried to make that happen. One of the groups that tried to make that happen were Russian revolutionaries, who in the early part of the 20th century sought to overthrow a very powerful and brutal regime in Russia. Russia at that time, in the early 20th century, was still under the rule of a king. There was no democracy in Russia. and it had been ruled by the King of Russia, who was called the Tsar, and his family for hundreds of years. There were major social issues in that country with poverty and with violence, and the Russian revolutionaries were able to get a bit of a foothold there. There was a lot of dissatisfaction, and then the toll that the war took on them was so terrible that towards in 1917 there was a revolution in February of that year that overthrew the Tsar, and he was put in prison along with his family, and later that year they were executed. Over the course of that year, there was a power struggle within Russia as to what kind of government they were going to have now that they got rid of the king. There were two groups called Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks were the more radical of the two. They wanted, to not have just a parliamentary democracy where you got to vote for your representatives in parliament. They wanted a more far-reaching revolution, and they wanted the Russian working people themselves to be directly running the country through workers' organisations. Now, these organisations were called Soviets, and they'd sprung up in the factories of the major cities in Russia. And these factories were beginning to organise themselves and run things. And the idea of the Bolsheviks was that eventually they would seize power and make sure that these Soviets were actually running the country in the interests of all. So in October that happened. There was a revolution. They did actually seize power, and power was meant to then be held by these workers' councils that were meant to be democratic. And it did start out that way. There were some tremendous achievements of the early days of the Russian Revolution that went on to inspire people all around the world. One of the first things that was done was that the land was taken away from the rich landowners and it was distributed to peasants so that it could be farmed in a better way, so that there was more equal distribution of wealth. For workers, the 8-hour day was brought in. Free education was opened up to all. There was a literacy campaign that began to teach people to read and write, because there were very low rates of literacy in Russia. It was a very, very backward country at the time. Laws were brought about to enable women to have more freedom, to get a divorce if they wanted one, and not be under the thumbs of their husbands. Various aspects of industry were nationalised, and probably the biggest thing of all was that Russia withdrew from World War One. They just ceased to fight in the war any longer. So all of these achievements actually inspired a lot of people, and around leading on from the Russian Revolution, that revolutionary feeling began to spread, and in particular it spread into Germany, where rebellion in the armed forces and amongst workers was one of the reasons that one of the ways that the war ended. That the end of the war for Germany was amid major revolution there as well, which didn't end up being successful in the same way that the Russian Revolution was, but it did actually end the German monarchy in Germany as well. Okay, so when all this was going on, of course, you've heard the phrase, let the ruling classes tremble. Well, the leaders of countries all around Europe and in Asia as well were quite concerned about all of this, and there was a backlash within Russia. There was a civil war where those opposed to the revolution fought. They were called the Whites, those who opposed it, and they fought against the revolutionaries, who were called the Red Army. The Red Army was led by a guy called Leon Trotsky, who lived from 1879 to 1940. He was one of the leading revolutionaries alongside Vladimir Lenin, who was the major leader of the Russian Revolution. Now, Lenin, I'll just talk a bit about him for a second. He lived from 1870 to 1924. Now, he, along with Karl Marx, is kind of the model for the old major character in Animal Farm. Old Major is the pig who gives the first kind of outline of what a revolution could look like for the animals on the farm. Now, in Animal Farm, he dies before the revolution, whereas Lenin doesn't die. Lenin lived through the revolution, but he did die just a few years later. And of course, Karl Marx was dead long before it. So he's kind of almost an amalgam of those two characters, a figurehead with ideas who inspired people, but who is then pretty quickly out of the picture in terms of what happened next. So Lenin was the leader of the Russian Revolution, and he then went on to die of illness in 1924. So around 7 years later. And in Animal Farm, Orwell is interested in showing how these dead leaders can become kind of almost turn into, godlike icons for a revolution, and then they then become kind of used by a regime. And Lenin's body was preserved after the revolution for people to go and look at. It's still there in Russia, and it can still be seen, 70, 80 years after, or even longer now. I think it's in the 90 years after he died. It's still being carefully preserved. And in Animal Farm, the novel, Old Major's skull is dug up and turned into almost like a religious artifact. Trotsky was one of the other leaders, and he was head of the Red Army, so helping to fight the White Army, and also fight all of the invading countries. So there are a whole bunch of Western countries who were very concerned about the Russian Revolution and sent troops into Russia. That included more than 10,000 American troops. There was also a British force that was made up of mainly Canadians, but also Australians, Indians, and there were people from Italy sent in, troops from Italy, a very large force from Japan, from Greece, Poland, China, Serbia. A whole lot of countries really didn't like this Russian Revolution, didn't want it spreading to their countries, and so were involved in trying to stomp it out. And you'll see that in Animal Farm, that the pressure that's put on the farm by the invading forces is one of the things that makes it difficult for them to hold on to the noble democratic ideas that they start out with. And that happened in Russia as well, that they were immediately basically fighting a war. And that went on for quite some time. So Trotsky was one of the leaders. Now and so was a guy called Stalin, Joseph Stalin. Now, when Lenin died in 1924, there was a power struggle between Trotsky and Stalin. And that went on for a couple of years, and Stalin eventually won. And Trotsky was removed from power in 1927. He was exiled from Russia, so sent out of Russia in 1929. And he went eventually to Mexico, where he continued to sort of argue against Stalin's rule in Russia and for a better way. Now, I think one of the major differences between Stalin and Trotsky was Trotsky held on to the idea that Russia needed to spread the revolution internationally in order for it to not only to succeed, but to hold on to those noble aims that on its own, isolated from the rest of the world, it wouldn't be able to fulfill the aims that it started out with. And whereas Stalin developed this idea that you could have socialism in one country. And he set about the idea of trying to industrialize Russia. And a lot of this was done in a very brutal fashion through a series of 5-year plans where farms were collectivized and there was forced labor and all sorts of things was done to force sort of a build-up of wealth and a growth in the economy, much of which was then channeled into building up military strength and so forth. And none of it really filtered back to Russian people. There were massive famines in that period as well. So Stalin was really all about building up Russia as a nation and not preserving any of that kind of democratic beginnings or so forth. Whereas Trotsky did believe in the idea of socialism and communism, but felt unless it spread to other countries, it was going to be entirely stomped out, which of course it was. Now, with Trotsky out of the picture in Russia, Stalin embarked upon basically nailing down his power, and that included killing off everybody who opposed him. And this happened. A lot of his old buddies from the Bolshevik Party were eventually arrested and put on trial and executed. And this occurred through a whole lot of show trials that called the Moscow trials that happened in the 1930s. And all of these people were forced to kind of, admit to having betrayed Russia, and then were executed for it. And you'll see these things begin to appear within Animal Farm. So you'll see that the animals are targeted and forced to confess to crimes and so forth. Now, within Animal Farm, you've got Old Major, the pig, that's sort of this Lenin, Karl Marx character. Then you've got this power struggle between two other pigs. Now you've got Snowball, who is meant to represent Trotsky, the one who gets kicked out. And you've got Napoleon, and he's meant to represent Stalin. And he's the one that kind of stays there and continues to increase his own power and control over the situation. So that's kind of how it all connects up, that you've got the pigs represent the major people, Stalin and Trotsky, and you've got some indications of some of the things within Russia that Orwell was, concerned about. You've got the effect of war on, basically putting enormous pressure on the country. You've got what we call internal purges, where people within the society itself are sort of scapegoated and they come into disfavour and then are either exiled or killed to get rid of them. And then going on from there, you have, the propaganda, the way that ideas and words can be used to swing an audience and to, create a sense of unity around a purpose and so forth, the way that people can be kind of swayed with all of that. And then the rewriting of history. So within Russia, there's evidence of photographs being doctored, and certainly, definitely rewriting of history. Trotsky's role in being the leader of the Red Army and in the revolution began to be kind of wiped out from Russian history, so that he began to be always portrayed as a traitor to Russia and so forth. So Orwell wanted to show the way that history in Russia and Trotsky's position within it had been rewritten as well. One of the other crucial things to do with this is the fact that people around the world were inspired by the Russian Revolution, and it took them a very, very long time to understand that it had all gone horribly wrong. And right through the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and even the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of people who still believed that what was going on in Russia was a good thing, because they didn't show to the outside world what they were doing to people. And so many people who really believed in a better world looked to Russia as an example, and Orwell wanted to challenge them on that. He himself was only really challenged on that when he went to Spain and fought in the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s. And when he was there, he got involved with some groups that were anti-Stalinist, supporters of Trotsky. And through his involvement in that, he saw how the Stalinists were operating, and he also nearly lost his life because they were ruthless, and he would have become another victim to them if he hadn't managed to escape. So that really awakened him to all of that. And then, of course, in World War II, Russia, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics as it was called, during World War II, Russia became an ally of Great Britain. And so he wanted to warn people about the nature of Russia more generally. So I'll leave it at that, and there are some other videos for you to have a look at if you're interested.